knowing that we were going to be on an indie budget, the things that make this period accurate and bring it sort of to life, they're not set build, it's actually just removing stuff. It was just like where we put the camera, and like I think to me it was like a lot of things, at least where I grew up, like they still feel like the 2000s. Like not a ton of stuff has changed, but when we were shooting outside, it was like, okay, this is great, a Tesla drove by, okay, we got to reset. And it was more like removing stuff as opposed to building stuff. As I left home and looked back at my childhood, I realized like, oh, there's certain things, not just from like a personal standpoint, but from like a generational standpoint. When I thought of when I was 13, like AIM, MySpace, Facebook, all this kind of stuff, I was like, I don't think I'd ever seen that depicted in a way that felt honest to like when me and my friends were that age. So it just kind of felt like ripe for setting and characters. And I grew up in the Bay, in Fremont, which just had like a really deeply rooted immigrant community, and like kind of like the kids in this movie, it's very multicultural and I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. What if you just kind of made this movie as specific as possible to that? Write hyper specifically to like kids that I grew up with, but not have it be this movie that's like so like about race. Like none of my friends were sitting there being like, aren't we so diverse? But it was like, but it did kind of inform the way that we felt and how we talked with each other and how we kind of went through life. One of my creative advisors was Lulu Wang, who did The Farewell, and I think she was the one who gave me this advice of like, I was kind of already leaning this way, but she was kind of like, you need to get all the personal out on the page, because that's the world building, that's the characters, that's the stuff that feels so vivid and lived in and textured. But once you get all that on the page, you have to then completely remove yourself and look at it objectively, and look at it as a story, and not look at it as like people in your life, but characters. And how do you take all those things that, again, are so vivid and textured, but then have them serve the themes of your story? And so like then we really talked a lot about like, well, what are the themes of your story? And I was like, oh, the theme I think is like, to me, it's how like shame manifests itself in this young boy's life. And that was just kind of on the page without trying to like force a theme. It was like, oh, that's the thing that's kind of the thread of everything. And she's like, well, if that's the theme, then like how does every single scene point towards that theme and support that theme? And so I kind of had to do that exercise once I was there. I was like, okay, what is every scene doing? How is it pointing towards this theme of shame, and how like embarrassment manifests itself into shame, and how does shame manifest itself into like anger or loneliness or sorrow? A lot of it is also like not talking to them as kids. Just talking to them about what the character is going through, and kind of, again, like not being condescending or pandering to them. And a lot of it was empowering them to kind of bring a lot of themselves to the character. The thing I kept telling them was like, you don't try to be a teenager in 2008, just be a teenager. Be like, what it's like to be a teenager more than like, I can remember how to write teenage dialogue. So a lot of, they would improv a lot of stuff, they would kind of like bring themselves to it, and then we would kind of put we would dress them in 2000s clothes. It was like, don't be afraid to see how elastic the sandbox is. A lot of the sort of like microaggressions that he kind of goes through, and that sort of like cultural misunderstanding, I don't know if it's something that kids like 13-year-old kids deal with today. I talked to Isaac, a lot about it. But I do think that element of shame through an Asian American boy's sort of lens, I think it was a lot more felt back then, that sort of like subtle ambivalence of like never quite feeling like you belong, even though everyone around you looks like you. That sort of gap between, oh, I look and am and talk a certain way, and I think I feel good, but then I look at the culture and no one looks like me or talks like me, or I'm always the butt of the joke. And like even the stuff in the movie where Maddie's like, oh, you're cute for an Asian. I'm like, I don't think kids hear that today anymore. But like a lot of me and my friends heard that. And so it was kind of like, it felt very, the themes of the movie could only be told in 2008. I don't know if this answers your question necessarily, but like, I think I knew that if and when this movie was released into the world, people would be like, oh, if in success, I think people were going to be like, oh, it's an Asian American movie, which I totally welcome that label, it very much is. But I think while we were making the movie, I kept kind of being like, this is not an Asian American story. Like, this is a story about a teenager who happens to be Asian American. because I feel like sometimes you try to make it an Asian American movie, and then you end up just like copying the movies that come before. It's like, oh, here's a close up of a rice cooker, and here's the house is super red for some reason, and it's just like. And I think that was kind of the thing where it was like, okay, this is clearly something that's close to home. So I always kind of asked myself, don't make it more Asian. Like, don't try to do that, because I don't know what that means. I like just try and make it more personal. We were looking at like my old family photos and like finding sort of photo books of like suburban Asian America and trying to pull from stuff that, again, felt like not set dressing, but just like, okay, here's pictures. Like, this is literally what my house looked like in 2003 or something, and kind of like building it from there. And again, not trying to make it more Asian, but more personal, and more personal meant more Asian, you know, in that sense. And so it was a very like weird mental game, and that was kind of the thing we leaned on, and just hoped that that would kind of, you know, make it feel more authentic and lived in.